Hey guys, it's Kesara, and today I'm going to be doing my September mid-month wrap-up. So I never made an August wrap-up. I only realized that when I went to do this wrap-up, but I mean, it's really not necessary because I read I want to say 5 new books in August. I read City Born Great, which is the novella sequel to The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, which is fantastic, and I gave it 4 stars. I read Edge Dancer by Brandon Sanderson, which is a novella between Words of Radiance and Oathbringer, and was also fantastic, which I absolutely loved, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I also did read Imago and Adulthood Rights by Octavia E. Butler, which were the second and third book in the Genogenesis trilogy, which were absolutely fantastic, and I absolutely loved them as well, and I ended up giving them 4.5 and 4.75 stars. And lastly, the 5th book that I read in August was Midnight Sun by Stephanie Meyer, which I actually did a whole video on, so I will link that up in the cards if you guys are interested in it. Let's just say I liked it surprisingly more than I expected to. I have read a ton of books in September so far. I'm actually only going to wrap up the books that I read in the first 2 weeks of September. So that was from the 1st to the 11th. And I read 15 books, something completely ridiculous like that. So there is a ton for me to get into. And I have to say, I loved a lot of the books that I read. Now, mind you, my September month is my sci-fi month. So there are going to be a ton of great sci-fi books here. And I also sprinkled in quite a bit of horror, thriller, and even a contemporary fiction book in there. But if you're looking for a lot of fantasy, you might be a bit disappointed in this wrap-up. Don't worry, I have a lot of fantasy planned for the second half of the month. But for the first half of the month, I really didn't get to very much fantasy at all. But without further ado, let's just get into the books that I read in the month of September so far. So we're gonna start this off with my DNF for the month, which is The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. So I got this book from NetGalley, and it was also available as an audiobook from my library. So I decided to switch between the ebook and the audiobook, and I was really intrigued by this book because it is sort of a fantasy horror crossover with a lot of witchy vibes, because it's called The Year of the Witching, obviously, and it's also set in a historical setting. So I went into this book expecting this historical fantasy book that is very atmospheric and very creepy. I just did not get that at all. First of all, I did not like the audiobook at all. The audiobook narrator is just really stiff and dry, and the writing, I feel did not lend to audio very well. It just wasn't the beautiful atmospheric writing that I was expecting from this type of book. This type of book, I feel really works with a very subtle type of writing with lush sort of descriptions, and just you want that creepy vibe to it. And I just didn't really get that. There was one scene in particular that was a bit creepy, but I liked the scene for its storytelling, not because of the way the scene was depicted. I didn't get super far into this book. I think I read the first hour of the audiobook and just decided that this book was not for me. It was not the type of book that I was looking for when I went into it. So I decided not to finish this book, and I really didn't get very far into it to give you my thoughts and opinions, other than it just wasn't giving me what I wanted from this book. So next, I'm going to talk about my reread for the month. So far, I've only reread one book this month, and that's The Blade of Self by Joe Abercrombie. This is the first book in the First Law series, which the First Law series is one of my favorite series of all time. It is the ultimate grimdark fantasy series, and I absolutely love it. One slight negative thing before we get into all the good things is I absolutely hate the way this book starts. The very first scene of this book is the worst possible way to start one of my favorite series of all time. But other than that, I absolutely love everything about this book. Joe Abercrombie just excels at writing unlikable, morally gray, absolutely reprehensible people that you can't help but loving. I love every single character in this book, and while I don't always love the things that they do, because they do some terrible things at times, I understand where they're coming from every single time, and I always forgive them for it. So, I don't know why, but I just absolutely love that about his writing, and especially in this first book, he takes some very familiar approaches to the genre, and he uses a lot of very classical fantasy tropes that, while in this first book aren't necessarily twisted in interesting ways, in later books in the series, he does some some very interesting twists on those very familiar approaches. So I absolutely love this series. One of my favorite characters of all time, Glokta, is in this series. I absolutely love Glokta. Like literally the amount that I can talk about Glokta, I could probably do a whole video just on Glokta as a character because of how interesting and unique of a character he is. But I absolutely love everything about this series and the first book. This is like the third time that I've read this book, and of course I ended up giving it 5 stars. So now we're gonna move on to all of the new books that I actually finished in the month of September. Like always, I'm gonna start with my lowest rated book and work my way up to my highest rated. Okay, so we're gonna start this all off with The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. So this is a classic sci-fi novel, and H.G. Wells is one of those authors that's kind of hit or miss for me. I've read 4 books by him so far. I absolutely loved The Time Machine. I really enjoyed War of the Worlds. I didn't care for The Island of Dr. Moreau that much, and I just did not actually like The Invisible Man. I love the concept of this book. The concept of this book is so interesting because it's about a man who makes himself invisible by scientific means, so it's definitely hard sci-fi based, and he uses his invisibility to kill people, which is just like one of the most interesting concepts you can possibly get. There's so much potential for this, for morally great characters and interesting like science-based world building. I think he does a really good job when it comes to world building. Like the science-based world building was so well done that I was really annoyed by the lack of characterization in this book. Like there is absolutely no reason that I can see why this man would be a killer. Like there's no motivation there. There's no character development for that. And because of that, this book fell really flat for me. Like I loved the science side of this and the science fiction side of this, but when it came to the actual story side of this, I was just like, why am I even reading this? Like, why is this character doing what he's doing? Like, I did not understand it at all. There was like 0 characterization whatsoever. And because of that, I have to give this book 2.75 stars. But like world building wise, it was really well done. So next we have to talk about Crescent City by Sarah J. Maas. I'm really hesitant whenever I pick up a Sarah J. Maas book. She's one of those authors where like I can read her books and enjoy them immensely while at the same time still dislike the book. And I do feel like I did feel that way about House of Earth and Blood, which House of Earth and Blood is the first book in a new series that Sarah J. Maas has written for adults. So it's an adult like fantasy romance series. There wasn't as much romance in this book as I was expecting, which I actually really liked. I feel like it worked really well in this book. This book is set up as like sort of a murder mystery, and I feel like that worked really well in this book. There are some parts of this book I really liked and worked really well for me, specifically the tension and the suspense in this book I think worked really well, and the characterization. I think Sarah J. Maas does a really good job of writing characters. I do think she writes characters in a way that I particularly don't love. Like if Joe Abercrombie can write the most reprehensible people in a way that you can't help but loving, Sarah J. Maas does the exact opposite, where she writes like truly good people in a way that I can't help but disliking. But it does work because the characters do make you feel something, and yes, they are good people that at times I do really like as well. I did do a full review on this one, so I will link that up in the cards for you guys. But this book I ended up loving a lot more than I was expecting to. From the first book in a series for Sarah J. Maas, like I expected to just not love this book that much, and I ended up actually really enjoying it. So I ended up giving it 3.25 stars. So next we're going to talk about The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. I actually did a full review for this one, so I will link that up in the cards if you guys want to check that out. So this is a parallel world sci-fi book that is following a character named Kara. The interesting sci-fi part of this is that you can't visit one of the parallel worlds in which your other self lives in because you can't have multiple copies of the same person in the same world. So our main character Kara is particularly interesting because she has died in 372 of the 380 found worlds that they have, which makes her incredibly useful. I think this book does a really good job when it comes to like the social and cultural aspects. It has a very complex social construct to it that I really love. It has some really good setups and twists in this book. It has thriller elements that I really like, but I will say I was a bit disappointed on the sci-fi side because while it does have a very interesting sci-fi setup, it doesn't do that much with it, if that makes sense. Like I expected to see more of these 372 worlds in which Kara can go to, and we see maybe 3 of them. That disappointed me a little bit, but I did enjoy this book otherwise, and I ended up giving it 3.75 stars. Next, I want to talk about The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. This book is an absolute classic and a must-read for anyone who loves sci-fi. It's about a man who is an ambassador for the humans, and he goes to the world to make first contact with an alien race. This alien race lives on this kind of like winter planet where it's always really cold, and because of that, their progress has been very slow. So it's taking them thousands of years to get to the same level of technology that humans got to in maybe like hundreds of years. So they're a very old race of aliens, but they are also very different from humans in the sense that they're gender fluid. Everyone in their society is gender fluid, which is really interesting. And this book, because of that, is incredibly thought-provoking in really interesting ways. I will say I'm a little disappointed with this book, but I think that's more because I went into this with a little high expectations, because a lot of people, like, they talk about this book like it's one of the best books of all time, and I do think it's really thought-provoking in interesting ways, but I was a little disappointed, maybe specifically more with the audiobook than anything else. I didn't really like the audiobook narrator, and he was a little stiff at times, and because this writing is a little bit drier than I typically read, I was getting very At the Mountains of Madness sort of vibes, which is a classic horror novel that I absolutely love, but I didn't go into this book expecting those types of vibes. Like, I went into this book expecting more feel-good vibes, which, like, the story of this book has more feel-good vibes to it, but I think the audiobook just didn't lend very well to that. I do think I will reread this book in the future, and hopefully I'll like it more if I read the physical copy rather than listening to the audiobook, but I did enjoy it overall, and I ended up giving it 4 stars. So the next book I want to talk about is The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nivo. This is an Asian-inspired fantasy novella, and I absolutely loved it. I have difficulty sometimes with high fantasy novellas that are not like parts of a wider series, and that's because a lot of times I feel like in such a short story, it's hard to get world building right. But man, does this author do world building so well. I absolutely loved the world building in this novella. I didn't even necessarily notice some of the other aspects. Like, I did love the characters, and I think it has a really interesting premise and point of view. It's told from the point of view of the handmaiden to the Empress. The Empress is a woman who was sent to another country for a political marriage, so there's a lot of intrigue with that, and there are definitely some interesting complications with the handmaiden. I love these characters, I love the plot of this book, but what really made this story for me, like I mentioned before, was the world building. The author did just such a good job of lush writing that just made you feel the atmosphere of this novella, and I'm so excited for the sequel to this novella, which is coming out soon. I'm so excited to read it, and I absolutely love this, and I ended up giving it 4.25 stars. So the next book that I'm going to talk about is To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini. So this book is a adult space opera sort of sci-fi book. It's following a character named Kira. She's on exploration when she falls through an alien structure and inadvertently starts a war. I've actually already done a full review of this book, so if you want to check that out, I will link it up in the cards for you guys. But this book has like literally everything you could possibly want from a space opera sci-fi like this. There is a massive war between humans and aliens. There are aliens that are enemies, there are aliens that are allies, there are aliens that are enemies but also maybe allies. There is this big bad boss alien who could be the destruction of humankind and seems completely impossible to destroy. There are a lot of great characters that you just absolutely grow to love. There's a bit of romance in this book. There is quite a bit of action, like lots and lots of action. There are space battles. There are spaceships that get into battles. There are humans in space without a spaceship that get into battles. There are nukes in this book. Like, there's literally everything. Oh, and there's also humans that become spaceships, because why not? I absolutely loved this book so much. I will say though, it is really long. Like, it is almost 900 pages, and there's a good like 25% of this book that seems to drag on forever. But if you get past like the 50% mark, trust me, it is completely worth it. All of that character development and world building in that first half half of the book really pay off in the end and has such great outcomes that I absolutely love this book so much, and I ended up giving it 4.25 stars. So the next book that I want to talk about is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So this is a classic horror novella that is stemmed from the idea of the psychotherapy in which people who suffer from anxiety were told to sit in a room and basically do nothing. There was like an actual treatment that were given to these people. The main character in this book is a woman who suffers from anxiety in that same way, and that's what she's given as a treatment. So she stays in this room and does nothing but stare at this yellow wallpaper. It basically makes her go crazy in the best way possible. I absolutely loved this. Just thinking of this book gives me goosebumps because it's so creepy in the way that it's written, and you follow like the main character as her mind basically deteriorates into this like crazy person, which she really wasn't at the beginning of the book. So I love that aspect of this book. It is definitely a very prolific book, and I love the way that it was done. I absolutely love this book, and I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. Also, the audiobook is fantastic. Definitely a classic that is worth reading. The next book that I'd like to talk about is Beach Read by Emily Henry. So this is a romance novel. It's about a romance writer, January Andrews, and a literary fiction writer, Augustus Everett, who decide to swap genres for the summer and try to write in each other's genres because January is in a bit of a writer's block after her father has died, and she found out a few things about him that she didn't know before. I really enjoyed the setup of this, and I really enjoyed some of the more complicated themes that this brought to the story, but at the same time, this is very much a cheesy romance novel, but I was there for it the entire time. One thing I will say about romance novels is if you can feel the chemistry between the two main characters, then it is a solid, really good romance novel, and I definitely felt the chemistry between these two main characters, so I absolutely loved it, and I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. And I also want to talk about the original by Brandon Sanderson and Mary Robinette Kowal. So this is an audio-only release of this novella. It's about 3.5 hours, and it's about a woman who wakes up to find out that she is actually a clone and her original self killed her husband. So she is tasked with finding and killing herself so that she can take her own place. It is such an interesting concept. I absolutely love the concept, and I kind of wish Mary Robinette Kowal and Brandon Sanderson would do more books together because it was so well written. Mary Robinette Kowal has a way of writing characters and describing things in a way that I absolutely love, and of course Brandon Sanderson brings fantastic world building and really great action-packed scenes to this novel. It has some of the most interesting sci-fi world building that I've seen in the longest while. I absolutely love the way the world building is done in this, and I really love the concept as well. The concept was really thrilling, and the execution of it was really well done. One thing I will say though, I did not love the audiobook. I'm very much a fan of more simplistic audiobooks. I don't love full cast audiobooks, and I don't necessarily love sound effects in my audiobooks because a lot of times I'm doing like other things while I'm listening to an audiobook, and when there are sound effects, it annoys me. And this audiobook had a lot of sound effects, like a lot of sound effects. It was almost like listening to a movie, but it got to the point where like I couldn't fully hear the narrator at times while I was listening to the audiobook. It was hard to differentiate the narrator at times from the sound effects, which I think wouldn't have annoyed me as much if I had a physical book or an ebook that I could follow along with, but since that wasn't an option, the audiobook really annoyed me. So while I love the story and I think the writing was really well done, audiobook did annoy me at times, so I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. The next book that I'd like to talk about is Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. This is one of my most anticipated reads of the year because I absolutely love Frederick Bachman, so of course I'm gonna read pretty much everything that he publishes. I think there's only one book by him that I haven't read yet, which is his nonfiction, The Things My Son Needs to Know, but I've read all of his other books. I feel like Frederick Bachman kind of has like two types of books. Books that follow kind of like one really eccentric person, and they're kind of quirky and odd and very character focused for that one character, or they're books that follow kind of one specific event and all of the characters that surround that event. Kind of like Beartown and Us Against You, this one definitely falls into that second category, which it follows the event of a bank robbery. And it turns out the bank robber was not very smart because he ended up robbing a cashless bank. And things go downhill from there. But what makes this book so interesting is the way that it's written, because it's following all of the characters that are involved with this bank robbery, and there's a lot of really interesting mysteries with this bank robbery and how it turns out, but you get to see each character's backstory and why they were in that place and what was going on in their head during that time and what was happening to them before and after the bank robbery itself. And it's really interesting. It's so character driven in the best way possible, and I absolutely loved that aspect of it. But another thing that I really loved about this book was just the structure of it. It doesn't follow a chronological timeline, if that makes sense. The first thing we see is the bank robbery itself, but then it goes back and tells us the backstories of each individual characters in interesting ways that connect in interesting ways, and you can kind of see how people are connected in the most tenuous of ways, and I just absolutely love that community aspect to it. It worked really well for me, while at the same time had this mystery aspect that worked really well as well, as in the sense of who is the actual bank robber and how are the police going to find him or her, and I just absolutely loved that aspect of it. This book worked really well for me. It's not necessarily my favorite Frederick Bachman book, because I do think Beartown still holds that torch, but I still absolutely love this book, and I ended up giving it 4.75 stars. So next I want to talk about Waking Gods by Sylvain Neuval. The first time I picked up a book by Sylvain Neuval, I absolutely fell in love with his writing style. He has a very action-based writing style. Like, it feels like watching an action movie, and it works really well for this type of book, because this book is told in like documents and interviews. There's no like actual narrator. I listened to the audiobook of this, which is full cast, and it works just so well for the stylistic way this book was written. This is actually the second book in the Themis Files. It's the sequel to Sleeping Giants, which I really enjoyed Sleeping Giants, but I absolutely loved Waking Gods. Like, I loved every second of this book. I think what worked really well for this book is that we got to know the characters a little bit more than we did in Sleeping Giants, and that really helped. And the action in this book is fantastic. I absolutely love the action in this book, and like literally I finished this book in less than a day. Like, I could not put it down because it is just so gripping. I almost picked up the third book in the series right away, but there is a time skip between the second and third book, just like there was a time skip between the first and second book, which, considering how fast paced and action packed these books are, it annoys me that there's these time skips in the books, but it's okay. I will get over it because they are so fantastically written. I absolutely loved this. My only complaint is that we didn't get to know the characters enough. It is weird that my only complaint is that I wanted to be inside the characters' heads, because I'm always the complete opposite, where I'm just like, there's way too much inside characters' heads. I want action. This book is like the exact opposite. I got all the action that I'm always looking for, and I wanted some thoughts from the characters. So like, it like completely turned me around from what I normally think about in books, but I love that it did that, and I ended up giving this 4.75 stars. Next, I have to talk about The Grown Up by Gillian Flynn. After I listened to The Yellow Wallpaper, I was just like, I need more like short, quick horror novels that'll give me what I want like right away. So I decided to pick up The Grown Up because it was a book that fell under like a list of like short horror novellas, and the audiobook was available in my library, of course. So I picked it up, and oh my gosh, I'm so glad that I did. First of all, I love Gillian Flynn. I love what she did with Gone Girl, and I definitely want to read more books by her. So when I saw The Grown Up, I was just like, I don't know what this book is about, but I'm excited for it. And man, was this book crazy. I absolutely loved it, and I actually really love the way that it ended, because you're not really sure what's real in the ending, which is what makes it so much better. It has three characters in this book. There is the main character, who is sort of a prostitute, but she's also sort of like a fake fortune teller as well, and she ends up going home with this lady to help her with her stepson slash potentially haunted house, and some crazy things happen. Gillian Flynn does such a good job of writing just like twisted characters in the most interesting way possible. I also think this book starts out in a very interesting way. Like, I'm not gonna say what it is, because it is a little graphic, the first couple of lines. Trigger warnings for prostitution. I absolutely loved this book. I think it did help that I went into it with like zero expectations because I had no idea what this book was about, but it completely blew me away and I ended up giving it 5 stars. We're almost to the end, guys, but I have some really great books left for you guys, and one of them is One by One by Ruth Ware. This is another new release that I read in the month of September, and I did not know going into this book that I was gonna love it as much as I did. Ruth Ware is one of those authors that just kind of grows on you. With every single book that I've read by her, I love her writing more and more. Like the first book that I read by her was In a Dark, Dark Wood, which I really enjoyed, and then I read The Turn of the Key, which was amazing, and I didn't think that she could top that, but man, I absolutely loved One by One. So it is set in a chalet in the French Alps, which is a very remote setting away from a lot of places. It's a ski resort, and a company rents out the resort for a company retreat, but before even the first day goes by, one of the main owners of the company falls off the side of the mountain and is presumed dead in a skiing accident. But then there is an avalanche and they are kind of stranded in this cabin with nowhere to go, no way to contact anyone, and suddenly they start dying one by one, and we have to figure out who the murderer is. This book was so gripping from the very beginning. I absolutely loved that pretty much all of the characters had their own secrets and had their own motivations, and I also loved that it was so difficult to determine who the killer was, but at the same time, everything like went in towards that person, and it made complete sense that that person would be the main killer. One thing that Ruth Ware does so well is atmosphere. I absolutely loved her atmosphere and her writing. It really felt like I was in the middle of winter at this ski resort, and I loved every second of that, and just how creepy this book could be at times was really well done. And there were some really great twists and turns and some action in this book. I do think though, like the last chapter or so went a little long, but I kind of like that it went long because we got a lot of closure to some of the character stuff that were brought up at the beginning of this book. Like honestly, I loved every single aspect of this book. There's not a single aspect of this book that I didn't love. I loved everything about it, and I ended up giving it 5 stars. Which, by the way, I also switched between the audiobook and the physical book, and the audiobook narrator, Imogen Church, is amazing. I absolutely love her as an audiobook narrator. Her narration paired with Ruth Ware's atmospheric writing is just the absolute perfect combination. And my absolute favorite book that I've read this month so far is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. If you guys have not read a book by Octavia E. Butler yet, you are missing out. I absolutely love her writing. To read one book by her is to fall in love with her writing forever because she has some of the most beautiful writing, and yet she has some of the most darkest and realistic ways of depicting her ideas, and she has some of the most interesting and thought-provoking ideas that I've ever read about. Parable of the Sower is a book that was ahead of its time. It is a near-future dystopian, and it just brings in a lot of things. I can definitely see our world potentially going to this level in the next 10 to 15 years if things go a certain way, which is definitely still possible. Like, this book was written in the 90s, but it's set in the early 2020s, and it's following a character named Lauren Olamina, and the United States and the world is going through a global climate change crisis, and also there is some social chaos in the early 2020s, because of course there is. And Lauren is growing up in this almost post-apocalyptic world, and while the government still exists, it doesn't exist in a way that helps the everyday people. And Lauren is growing up in this very small community that they're relatively safe, but things happen to the point where that is no longer the case, and the story is just absolutely heartbreaking and at the same time so gripping. And Lauren is a character that is just so faithful in a very particular way, but also very realistic, and I love that about her. I also love her ambition because she's very ambitious in a way that, again, is very realistic and wholesome, but also very idealistic in certain ways. And it's really kind of hard to wrap your head around that incongruity, but at the same time, this story brings up so many thought-provoking ideas and concepts, and I just loved everything about this book. It is definitely a hard book to read, but it is so fantastically done. I absolutely loved it, and I ended up giving it 5 stars. So if you read any of these books, let me know down in the comments. I would love to discuss with you guys. I post videos on Sundays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, so consider subscribing. And if you want to be notified as soon as I upload, you can click that little bell icon. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up to support my channel. All social media links are in the description down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.